A young black student named Malik had always dreamed of going to a top university. Growing up, he had been told that only the best of the best would make it into such prestigious places, and his heart was set on proving he could be one of those students. He worked hard, his mind always thinking about numbers and equations, and after years of dedication, he finally got accepted into one of the most elite universities in the country. The excitement was overwhelming when he first arrived. The campus was beautiful, with grand buildings, libraries filled with endless books, and green lawns that seemed to stretch forever. But with this excitement came a little fear. Malik had always been one of the few black students in his previous schools, and here, at the university, he found that he was again among a minority. He had grown used to the idea of having to work harder to prove himself in places where people might not expect much from him because of his background. But nothing prepared him for what he would face in this new environment. On his very first day of class, Malik was met with a mix of expectations. Some students looked at him with curiosity, while others seemed to make assumptions about him based on how he looked. Most of them had never encountered someone like him before. As he settled into his seat, he couldn't help but feel a little out of place. The professors, too, seemed to have their own ideas about who belonged in the classroom and who didn't. One of the professors, Dr. Thompson, had a reputation for being particularly tough and skeptical of students who came from underrepresented backgrounds. He stood in front of the class, a proud figure, and began discussing the upcoming course material. But his eyes scanned the room, pausing for a moment when they landed on Malik. There was something in his gaze, a mixture of doubt and surprise, that made Malik uncomfortable. He could feel the professor's silent judgment. Dr. Thompson made a point of asking Malik a question during the lecture, one that seemed simple enough but carried an edge. "Can you explain this concept to the class?" he asked, his tone more challenging than helpful. Malik hesitated for a moment, but he quickly gathered his thoughts and began to answer. He had studied hard for this moment, and he knew the material well. Yet the professor's tone didn't seem to accept his answer. The rest of the class seemed to hold their breath, as though waiting for Malik to falter. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him. Some students exchanged looks, as if to say, "Let's see how this goes." Malik felt a cold shiver run down his spine. It wasn't just a question about math. It felt like a test of whether he was even worthy of being there in the first place. But despite the awkward silence in the room, Malik stood his ground. He explained his answer clearly and precisely, giving examples that illustrated his understanding. He wasn't just trying to prove his knowledge. He was showing everyone that he belonged here as much as any of them. The professor didn't give him much praise for his answer, but instead moved on to the next student, ignoring the fact that Malik had just given a solid response. As the lecture continued, Malik noticed some of the students were still whispering about the question. It became clear that, to many of them, his success in answering the question didn't really matter. The assumptions had already been made. For some, the color of his skin seemed to tell them everything they needed to know. Malik could feel the weight of their expectations on him. He had always been a hard worker, but now, at this prestigious institution, he would have to prove not just his intelligence, but also his place in a world that often judged people based on their appearance rather than their ability. But as the day ended and he walked back to his dorm room, Malik couldn't help but feel a sense of determination grow inside him. He wasn't going to let this moment define him. He was going to show them all that he was more than capable. He was going to prove them wrong, one equation at a time. The following days at the university were filled with mixed emotions for Malik. He had always dreamed of this moment, but the reality of it was different from what he had imagined. Every day felt like a test, not just of his academic abilities, but of how much he could endure the subtle yet persistent doubts that others had about him. He was constantly trying to prove himself, not just to the professors, but to his classmates as well. One particular day, things took a turn for the worse. Malik had been attending a mathematics lecture that he had been particularly excited about. The topic was advanced, and Malik felt ready to show the professor that he was capable of understanding the material. As the lecture progressed, the professor, Dr. Thompson, began to explain a complicated concept that involved algebraic formulas and equations. Malik had already studied this material in his own time and was eager to contribute. When Dr. Thompson asked if anyone had any questions, Malik raised his hand. The professor didn't seem to notice at first, but then, with a slight wave of his hand, he gestured toward Malik. "Yes?" he asked, almost sounding like he was reluctantly calling on him. Malik took a deep breath and began explaining his understanding of the concept. He broke it down step by step, showing how he had solved a similar equation the night before. His voice was steady, and he was confident in his explanation. But as he spoke, he could feel the tension in the room. Some of the other students seemed to be whispering, and he could sense their skepticism. They were probably wondering what this black student was doing, talking so confidently about something they assumed he wouldn't understand. Dr. Thompson didn't seem impressed. He interrupted Malik mid-sentence, saying, "That's all well and good, but I think you might be missing the bigger picture here." His tone wasn't supportive. It was dismissive. "This is a difficult concept. Perhaps you should revisit the material." Malik felt his face flush. It wasn't just the professor's words that stung. It was the way the entire class seemed to turn against him in that moment. He had worked so hard to get to this point, and yet the smallest mistake felt like it would be the thing they would remember. Some students seemed to be nodding in agreement, while others glanced at each other as if to say, "I knew it." He tried not to let it get to him. He knew that this wasn't about the math. It was about something bigger. It was about the assumptions people had made about him before he even opened his mouth. But despite his best efforts to stay calm, he couldn't shake the feeling of humiliation. It wasn't just the professor's doubt. It was the fact that no one was willing to see him as capable. No one except himself. The rest of the class passed in a blur. Malik's focus was broken, and he couldn't seem to get back into the rhythm of the lecture. His thoughts kept drifting to what had just happened. How could they all dismiss him so easily? Why did they think he didn't belong here? He had spent years preparing for this moment, and yet it felt like no one cared about the work he had put in. All they saw was the color of his skin. As the lecture ended and the students filed out of the room, Malik stayed seated, his mind racing. He knew that he couldn't let this moment define him. He had to rise above it. But the question kept repeating in his mind, would they ever see him for what he truly was, a student who was just as capable as anyone else in that room? He stood up, gathering his things slowly. The doubts about his place in this world seemed louder than ever. But deep down, Malik knew one thing. No matter how many times they tried to push him down, he would always rise. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Malik spent the following days in a quiet storm of thoughts. Every time he entered a classroom, he could feel the weight of the doubts surrounding him. The subtle stares from classmates, the quiet murmurs after he spoke, he couldn't escape them. The more he tried to brush it off, the more it seemed to stick to him like a shadow. But despite everything, he refused to let it break him. He knew he had something valuable to offer, something that was buried beneath the stereotypes and assumptions. Instead of focusing on the negative energy that seemed to follow him, Malik threw himself into his studies. He spent long hours in the library, alone with the books and problems. There in the quiet corners of the university, he felt most at peace. The math problems on the pages were like puzzles that needed to be solved, and Malik loved solving puzzles. His mind flowed easily through the formulas and equations, understanding the concepts as if they were second nature. He could see the patterns, the relationships between numbers, and the underlying beauty in the problems. At night, when the campus grew quieter, Malik worked even harder. He would revisit everything from his lectures, sometimes even reworking problems that had already been solved just to see if he could approach them differently. It was during these solitary hours that Malik began to see his true potential. The more he studied, the more confident he became in his own abilities. He wasn't just learning for the sake of passing exams. He was discovering his passion, his calling. One evening, As Malik was sitting in the library, a thought crossed his mind. He could solve things that others struggled with. It wasn't arrogance. It was just a quiet confidence that grew from knowing the work he was putting in was paying off. Malik was beginning to realize that the more he worked, the more his understanding of mathematics seemed to deepen. What others found difficult, he was learning to see with ease. As weeks passed, Malik began to stand out in his own subtle way. Whenever he encountered a particularly difficult problem in class, he would quietly raise his hand, confident in the answer he was about to give. He wasn't flashy or loud about it, but his answers were always right. They were precise, clear, and showed a deep understanding of the subject. Still, there was a part of him that wondered if his professors were really seeing his true potential or if they were still blinded by their own biases. Despite the doubts around him, Malik kept pushing forward. He realized that his quiet work was beginning to pay off. There were moments when his classmates would ask him for help with a problem, and he would explain it with patience and clarity. The questions he answered with ease were often the same ones that his peers had struggled with, but no one could deny that his explanations were always thorough and easy to follow. What Malik didn't know was that his quiet persistence was beginning to have an effect on others. Slowly but surely, his classmates started to look at him differently. Instead of viewing him as the student who didn't belong, they began to see him as someone with real knowledge and skill. They started approaching him for help more often, asking him to explain things in a way that made sense to them. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but the respect he was earning was beginning to show. Malik wasn't yet fully aware of the change happening around him. He didn't need recognition or praise. He was just focused on improving himself. But deep inside, he knew one thing for sure. No matter how hard they tried to overlook him or doubt him, he would continue to rise. His passion for learning, his relentless work ethic, and his ability to see things through a different lens were all part of who he was. And that was enough for him. One afternoon, Malik found himself in a situation he hadn't expected. It was the middle of the semester and the pressure was starting to build. His professors had given the class a particularly difficult problem to solve, a real challenge designed to test their skills and understanding of the subject. The problem was so complex that many of the students in the class were openly worried about whether they could solve it. Malik knew he had been preparing for something like this, but there was still a lingering doubt in his mind. He spent the next several hours in the library, poring over the problem. It was a mix of algebra and calculus, with a touch of geometry thrown in for good measure. The problem seemed designed to trip students up, to make them feel that there was no way out, that no one could solve it. Malik stared at the pages, the numbers swimming before his eyes. But instead of feeling defeated, he felt his resolve strengthen. He had worked hard for this moment. He wasn't about to let a complicated problem stand in his way. Malik started to break the problem down into smaller parts. He tackled the first equation, then the second, and slowly, step by step, the pieces began to fall into place. It was like solving a puzzle. Each solution led to the next, and soon enough, Malik had the entire problem solved in front of him. He checked his work over and over, making sure each step was correct. He felt a quiet sense of pride as he looked over the result. He knew this wasn't just about passing a test. This was about proving something to himself. The next day, the professor, Dr. Thompson, announced that they would be discussing the problem in class. Malik sat quietly, waiting for the professor to call on someone to explain their solution. He didn't know if anyone else had figured it out yet, but he didn't care. What mattered was that he had solved it. It was a small victory, but it was enough for him to feel like his hard work was finally paying off. Dr. Thompson began the discussion by asking for volunteers to explain how they solved the problem. Students hesitated, unsure of their answers. Malik's hand shot up, and Dr. Thompson looked at him, a bit surprised. "Yes, Malik," the professor asked, his tone almost reluctant. Malik stood up, holding the notebook with his solution. He explained the steps he had taken to solve the problem, speaking clearly and confidently. His explanation was simple, but thorough. breaking down each step in a way that made the complex problem seem easy to follow. The students who had struggled with the problem the day before were now listening intently, some nodding along, others taking notes. As Malik spoke, he could feel the eyes of his classmates on him. This time, there was no whispering or judgment. They were focused on what he was saying, paying attention to his every word. Dr. Thompson, too, seemed to listen carefully, his usual stern expression softening just a little. Malik finished his explanation, and there was a brief moment of silence before the professor spoke again. "Well, it seems Malik has cracked the problem," Dr. Thompson said, his voice a little more respectful than usual. "Well done, Malik." It wasn't much, just a few words of praise. But for Malik, it was more than enough. It wasn't just about the recognition. It was the fact that he had been able to solve the problem that had stumped so many others. It was a sign that his hard work, his determination, and his belief in himself were starting to show results. After class, a few students came up to him, asking how he managed to solve the problem. Malik smiled politely and offered them a few tips, explaining his process without hesitation. As he walked out of the classroom, he felt a small sense of pride. It wasn't about being better than anyone else. It was about proving to himself that he had what it took to succeed, no matter how difficult the road ahead seemed. That day, Malik realized that it wasn't the praise from others that mattered most. It was the confidence he gained from his own abilities. And with that confidence came the knowledge that he could face any challenge that came his way. As the weeks passed, Malik began to feel a shift in the atmosphere around him. His classmates, who had once looked at him with skepticism, now seemed to view him with a sense of respect. It wasn't obvious at first, but little by little things were changing. More students started approaching him after class, asking for help with problems that they couldn't quite figure out. At first, Malik was a bit surprised. He wasn't used to being the one others turned to for guidance. But as he helped them, explaining each step carefully, he began to feel a sense of pride that he hadn't expected. It wasn't just that he was good at math, it was that he could help others understand it too. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult lecture, Malik was walking out of the classroom when he was stopped by one of the professors. It was Dr. Thompson, the very same professor who had once doubted his abilities. Malik had never really spoken to him outside of class, but now, as Dr. Thompson approached, Malik couldn't help but wonder what was going on. "Malik," the professor said, his tone a little more casual than usual, "I wanted to speak with you for a moment." Malik paused, a little surprised. "Sure, Dr. Thompson. What's up?" The professor seemed to hesitate for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "I've noticed something recently," he began. "You've been helping your classmates with their work, and I have to admit, I didn't expect that from you. I wasn't sure you had the ability to contribute in that way, but it seems I was wrong." Malik's heart skipped a beat. He had never expected such words from Dr. Thompson. It wasn't just a compliment. It was an acknowledgement of something he had worked so hard to prove. The professor continued, "I've been watching you closely. Your understanding of the material is impressive, and I think you're capable of a lot more than you've been given credit for." Malik wasn't sure what to say. He had always believed in his abilities, but hearing it from Dr. Thompson was different. It was like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. He had never sought validation from anyone, but hearing those words made all the effort feel worthwhile. "I appreciate that," Malik said, his voice steady. "I've just been doing my best to learn and help others where I can." Dr. Thompson gave a small nod. "You're doing more than just learning, Malik. You're teaching others, too. Keep that up." Malik felt a sense of pride that he hadn't expected. It wasn't about proving anything to the professor anymore. It wasn't about showing anyone that he could succeed despite the doubts they had. It was about the quiet confidence he had gained through his own work and the way he had begun to inspire others to push themselves. Over the next few weeks, things continued to change. Malik didn't just find himself helping his classmates more often. He found that he was actually enjoying it. He loved watching the light bulb moments when his classmates finally understood a concept that had once seemed too difficult. It was a feeling of accomplishment that went beyond solving equations. It was about helping others reach their potential, too. One afternoon, as Malik was walking through the hallways, he overheard a conversation between two of his classmates. "I was stuck on that last problem in the homework," one of them said. "But Malik really helped me out. He made it all make sense." Malik smiled to himself as he walked past. He didn't need to be recognized or praised for every little thing he did, but it was nice to know that his efforts were having an impact. He wasn't just surviving in this environment anymore. He was thriving. And it wasn't just because he was good at math. It was because he had found a way to connect with others, to build relationships, and to show everyone, including himself, that he was capable of greatness. The professor's words stuck with him. "You're teaching others too." It wasn't just about the grades or the tests anymore. Malik had become more than just a student. He had become a source of inspiration for others. And that, he realized, was the true reward. As the semester continued, Malik's reputation as a brilliant math student began to spread. More and more of his classmates were coming to him for help, and he found himself becoming more involved in study groups and tutoring sessions. Malik had never considered himself a teacher, but now, every time he helped someone understand a complicated formula or equation, he felt a growing sense of fulfillment. It wasn't just about solving problems for himself. It was about showing others how they could unlock the answers too. One day, after a particularly challenging class, Malik was approached by a student he hadn't interacted with much before. Her name was Sarah, and she was known for being one of the top students in the class, someone who always had the right answers. Malik was a little surprised when she asked him for help. "Malik, do you have a minute?" Sarah asked, her voice a little hesitant. "Of course. What's up?" Malik replied, genuinely curious. "I've been trying to understand the latest concept we learned, but I can't quite wrap my head around it," Sarah admitted. "I know this sounds silly, but could you explain it to me?" Malik raised an eyebrow. Sarah was the kind of student who had always seemed to have everything figured out. But here she was, asking for his help. It was an unexpected turn, but one that Malik welcomed. He was eager to help her, just as he had helped so many others. "Sure, I'd be happy to," Malik said. He walked Sarah through the concept, breaking it down step by step, making sure she understood each part before moving on to the next. As they worked together, Malik realized something. It wasn't just the math that mattered. It was the way he could make the material accessible, breaking down complex ideas into simpler pieces. It was something that had come naturally to him. But now, he could see the impact it had on others. Sarah's face lit up as the confusion lifted, and she finally understood the concept. "That makes so much more sense now," Sarah said, smiling in relief. "Thank you so much, Malik. I honestly don't think I would have gotten it without your help." Malik smiled back, feeling a quiet pride. "I'm just glad I could help." As the weeks went by, Malik's role in the class continued to evolve. He wasn't just a student who showed up to learn. He had become someone who actively contributed to the success of others. His professors began to take notice, too. One day, Dr. Thompson asked him to stay after class for a brief conversation. "I've been hearing a lot of positive things about you, Malik," Dr. Thompson said as Malik stayed behind. "It seems you've been helping a lot of your classmates, and your understanding of the material is stronger than ever. I have to say, I'm impressed." Malik hadn't expected the professor to say anything like that. It wasn't just about the grades anymore. It was about the way he was making a difference in the classroom. It felt good to finally be seen for his abilities, not his background. "Thanks, Dr. Thompson. I've just been doing what I can," Malik replied, trying to stay humble. "I think you're capable of even more than what you've been doing," Dr. Thompson said thoughtfully. "You're not just learning the material, you're teaching it. And that's something not every student can do." Malik wasn't used to receiving praise like this, but it felt good. It was a sign that all his hard work and determination were starting to pay off in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had gone from being a student who was doubted to someone whose abilities were now being recognized. But more than that, he had gone from being a passive participant in his education to someone who actively contributed to the success of others. That night, as Malik sat in his dorm room, reviewing his notes and preparing for the next class, he thought about how far he had come. It wasn't just about proving the doubters wrong anymore. It wasn't even about excelling in math. It was about the way he had learned to share his knowledge, to connect with others, and to help them succeed. Malik had discovered something about himself that he hadn't known before. He was more than just a student. He was a mentor, a leader, and a guide for those who needed it. And as he thought about the future, Malik knew that his journey was just beginning. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, but he was ready to face them, armed with the knowledge that he had the power to shape his own destiny, and the destinies of others, too. As the semester moved forward, Malik's presence in the classroom became undeniable. His quiet determination and steady focus had turned him into a key figure in his class. Students who had once been unsure of him now sought him out for advice and guidance. They saw him as someone who not only understood the material but could explain it in a way that made even the hardest concepts feel simple. He had become more than just a student. He was an essential part of the learning experience for many of his classmates. Malik wasn't the kind of person who sought recognition, but he couldn't help but notice the way things were changing. He was still the same student who had walked into the university unsure of himself, but now he walked with his head held higher. He had earned the respect of his peers, and more importantly, he had earned his own respect. Every day, he pushed himself to be better. And with each small victory, he realized just how much he had grown. One afternoon, Malik was sitting in the campus library, his usual study spot, when he saw Sarah again. She had been one of the first students to ask for his help, and their study sessions had helped both of them form a solid understanding of the material. Today, however, she looked different. She had a kind of energy about her that Malik couldn't ignore. "Hey, Malik," Sarah said, walking over to his table. "I just wanted to let you know. Thanks again for all your help. I've been thinking about it, and I'm actually doing a lot better in the class now. I couldn't have done it without you." Malik smiled, his chest swelling a little with pride. "I'm glad it helped. You did the hard work, though. I just gave you a hand with it." Sarah laughed. "Well, you definitely made it a lot easier. I really appreciate it." Malik nodded, but before he could say anything else, she added, "Actually, there's something else I wanted to tell you. I'm working on this big project for another class, and I'm struggling with some of the math concepts. Would you be willing to help me out again?" Malik didn't hesitate. "Of course, I'd be happy to help." As they started discussing the details of her project, Malik felt a growing sense of pride. Sarah wasn't the only one who had noticed the change in him. It wasn't just about the math anymore. It was about the way he had become someone others could rely on. He had built trust, not through words, but through actions. He wasn't just showing up to class and solving problems for himself. He was becoming a steady source of support for those around him. That evening, as he walked back to his dorm, Malik thought about how much he had learned. The lessons hadn't just come from textbooks or lectures. They had come from the people around him. The trust and respect he had built with his classmates had become more important than any grade he could earn. He had finally realized that the real reward wasn't the recognition from the professors or the grades on his assignments. It was the impact he was making on others. Later that week, Malik was walking down the hallway when Dr. Thompson stopped him once again. This time, however, there was something different in the professor's eyes. There was a level of respect in his gaze that hadn't been there before. "Malik," Dr. Thompson said, "I've been keeping an eye on your progress, and I have to admit, you've done something impressive. Your understanding of the material is beyond anything I expected." Malik wasn't sure what to say. "Thank you, Dr. Thompson. I don't say this lightly," the professor continued, "but I've been talking to some of your other professors. Your performance has been outstanding, and you've shown a real ability to help others. I think it's time we start thinking about your future in a different way." Malik was taken aback. "What do you mean?" "You're more than just a student here, Malik. You're someone who has the potential to teach, to lead, to inspire. I'd like to talk to you about some opportunities for the future. Internships, mentorship programs. There's more out there for you than you realize." Malik stood there, speechless. He had never expected this kind of recognition, especially from someone like Dr. Thompson. It was one thing to prove himself in a classroom. It was another to be seen as someone who could make a real impact on the world beyond the university. "I'd be honored," Malik finally said, feeling a mix of pride and disbelief. As he walked away, Malik couldn't help but feel like his journey was just beginning. The university had once seemed like an intimidating place, but now it felt like the start of something much bigger. His hard work and perseverance had paid off, not just in terms of grades, but in the way people were beginning to see him. And with each new opportunity, he realized that this was just the beginning of what he could achieve. As the final weeks of the semester approached, Malik found himself reflecting on how far he had come. It had been a challenging journey, one that had tested not only his abilities but his resolve. He had entered the university feeling uncertain, unsure of how he would fit in, and facing doubt from others who didn't believe he belonged there. But now, as he stood on the brink of completing his first semester, he could see how much he had grown, not just as a student, but as a person. His relationship with his classmates had transformed. Where there had once been skepticism, there was now respect. The students who had initially overlooked him or doubted his abilities now came to him for advice and support. Malik had never sought to be a leader, but as time went on, he had become one in his own quiet way. He didn't seek the spotlight, but when someone needed help, he was always there. And in doing so, he had earned the trust of his peers. As the semester drew to a close, Malik was invited to meet with Dr. Thompson again. The professor had been a significant figure in his journey, initially one of the most critical voices doubting Malik's abilities, but now one of the strongest supporters of his potential. "Malik," Dr. Thompson began, his voice calm and measured, "I've been following your progress closely, and I have to say, I'm impressed. Not only have you excelled in your studies, but you've gone above and beyond by helping your classmates succeed as well. That's not something every student can do." Malik smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. It wasn't the kind of praise he had ever expected. He had come to the university to prove to himself that he could succeed, but hearing those words from Dr. Thompson felt like a validation of everything he had worked for. "I'm just doing what I love," Malik replied, humbly. "Helping others feels good." Dr. Thompson nodded thoughtfully. "That's the spirit of a true leader, Malik, and that's why I'm going to recommend you for a mentorship program. We have an initiative where top students mentor incoming freshmen, helping them navigate the challenges of the university. I think you'd be perfect for it." Malik's heart skipped a beat. A mentorship program. He hadn't imagined anything like that when he first walked onto campus, unsure of where he fit. Now, here he was, being offered an opportunity to guide others, just as he had been guided. It felt surreal, but in the best possible way. "I'd love to do that," Malik said, excitement bubbling in his chest. "I've learned a lot here, and if I can help someone else, I would." Dr. Thompson smiled. "I knew you'd say that. You have a gift, Malik, and I think you're just getting started." As Malik left the professor's office, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known before. The future was wide open, filled with possibilities. He had come to the university with one goal in mind, to prove himself, and in doing so, he had discovered something even more important: the power of helping others. His journey had not been about proving others wrong or showing that he belonged. It had been about building relationships, lifting others up, and finding strength in his own quiet persistence. The next few weeks flew by in a blur of finals, study sessions, and celebrations with friends. When the semester finally ended, Malik stood at the doorway of his dorm room, looking out over the campus. He had come a long way, and he knew this was just the beginning. The road ahead was still long, but he was ready for whatever came next. He had faced his doubts, overcome the skepticism of others, and emerged stronger for it. Malik was no longer just a student at a prestigious university. He was someone who had the power to make a real difference. As he walked off into the future, Malik knew one thing for sure. No matter where his journey took him, he would always remember the lessons he had learned here. The power of believing in himself, the importance of lifting others up, and above all, that with hard work, determination, and a little help from others, anything was possible.